Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Planning Committee, I'd like to welcome you to Day 2 of the 31st Annual Bar Media and Judiciary Conference. For the second year, presented with the organizational support of the Georgia First Amendment Foundation. My name is Peter Canfield. I'm with Jones Day, and I have the pleasure to serve as the conference chair. Yesterday's panel in the Arbery case was a terrific start, and we have more in store for you today. For the full rundown, please check the chat. When the session starts, we'll post links there to the current agenda, panelist bios, and reference materials. If you're a judge or attorney seeking CLE credit, please be sure to identify yourself on screen by the name you registered to confirm your attendance. If you have questions for the panels, please post them in the chat. The panelists and the moderator will be able to see them and will do their best to get to them as time permits. We could not produce this conference every year without our sponsors. The names of the sponsors are now on the screen. I want to give particular shout outs to the State Bar of Georgia, to CNN, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Daily Report, the Council of Superior Court Judges, the other judges' councils, and the Administrative Office of the courts. I'd also, of course, like to thank our supporting law firms. Now we'll turn to the second session of the conference. Each year, the conference tries to tackle reporting on timely issues, and it's hard to imagine any more timely and increasingly controversial issue now than our public schools. The discussion to follow was organized by Meredith Kincaid with the help of Sarah Brewerton Palmer. They've assembled a really star team of panelists. I want to now introduce Meredith, a frequent contributor to this conference. She's a partner in the Summerville law firm and the mother of young children and will moderate the session. Meredith?
Thank you so much, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first panel of the day, What's Going On? Parents, the Press, and Public Education. I'm Meredith Kincaid, as Peter said, a lawyer with the Summerville law firm, and I'll be moderating our discussion for the next hour. You know, it wasn't that long ago that we saw calls for a renewed emphasis on civics education in our schools as an antidote for democratic disengagement and to spur racial discourse and understanding. And this has seemed to shift in the last few years to where now the schools themselves have become a pitched battleground over COVID, public health, and increasingly the curriculum, including blacklisting books and how, and even if we teach certain lessons of history. We have some great panelists today here to talk through the challenges being faced by those trying to stay informed on these topics and how the media is handling these issues. So I'll just run down the list alphabetically with my introductions. First, we have Nicole Carr. Nicole is an award-winning investigative journalist, professor, and speaker based in Atlanta. She joined ProPublica in June 2021 as a reporter covering the criminal justice system and racial inequity in the South. Her initial work for ProPublica explores the fallout of COVID policy and decisions in Georgia's second largest school district. Carr is also an adjunct journalism professor at Morehouse College, where she developed and teaches a new social justice journalism course. Before joining ProPublica, she spent more than a decade as a television journalist, including for WSB TV here in Atlanta. Thank you for being here, Nicole. Maureen Downey is, I'm sure, a name that's familiar to many of you. She's a longtime reporter for the AJC, where she writes about local, state, and federal education policy. She also writes the Get Schooled blog on ajc.com and a weekly print column on education issues. Maureen, thank you for being here. Jason Esteves is an at-large representative and the outgoing board chair on the Atlanta Public Schools Board of Education. In 2013, he became the first Latino elected to a school board in Georgia and has focused his efforts on promoting equity and improving the financial outlook of the school system. In November 2021, Jason was reelected to his third term on the board. In his time on the board, Jason has worked with his colleagues to tackle controversial issues, including overseeing the process of renaming APS buildings with hurtful legacies and creating an LGBTQ+ task force that recommended policy changes and additional support for those students and staff in the district. He also recently announced a run for state senate in the seat vacated by Jen Jordan in her run for attorney general. Thank you for being here, Jason. And our final panelist is Timmy Foster, the principal at Parkside Elementary School, which is part of Atlanta Public Schools. Full disclosure, my oldest daughter goes there and it's wonderful. Prior to joining Parkside, Mr. Foster was the principal of Whitford Elementary School, dating back to 2011. He started his career as a 5th grade teacher in the DeKalb County school system. And he then moved to Clayton County School District and worked his way up to principal at Morrow Elementary School. Principal Foster, thank you so much for being here as well. All right, thank you everyone for joining. Let's dive right in. Okay, so why don't we start with COVID, an issue that's dominated so many of our lives that probably nobody wants to talk about. The pandemic, of course, threw a wrench into all kinds of issues, including what we do with schools. How should schools remain virtual? How long should they remain virtual? When will they reopen? What's the best way to keep kids and school staff safe? How do we handle testing, masks, vaccines, exposures, case spikes? For 2 years now, school officials and teachers have had to tackle all of these incredibly difficult and unprecedented issues in real time, and have been met with some serious pressure and resistance by parents in all directions. Nicole, can you start us off with a brief overview of some of the major issues that schools have faced in the pandemic and where we are now? How have some of the Metro Atlanta school districts approached the pandemic in different ways?
Sure, and thank you for putting this panel together. Really glad to join all of you all for this discussion. I think before we talk about the way districts have handled anything, we have to understand the structure that we were working within, right? This was largely, and depending on what issue we're talking about, this has largely been framed as a local control issue. And so because we're talking local control and we are talking about the pandemic being politicized at the same time, you can imagine the schools of thoughts in 159 counties and even more school districts across our state. We were facing the same thing that districts across the country were. In some places you saw school boards or district offices working in lockstep with the local health departments on protocols on how they were going to approach this thing. In other districts, you saw health officials and school officials at odds about how to get from point A to point B, what to do. We saw misinformation, disinformation leading the way in some conversations and not others. And so it just really depended on where you were. In some cases, let's take Fulton County schools, for example, you had benchmarks that would determine protocols, right? So if we get to X amount of cases, or we get to this many hospitalizations, then we're going to change the way that we approach this. And you guys need to be ready, parents, teachers, staff, you need to be ready to pivot at a moment's notice. In other districts, there were no benchmarks. Here in Cobb County, there were never benchmarks for if we were going to change protocols or not change protocols. And in fact, because of the makeup of the school board and the rule changes, the issue of COVID has never made its way onto a school board agenda. Like never during the entire pandemic, it's never been an agenda item, which is much different from public comment, right? So you had a wide range of approaches. As we entered this year, I believe Rockdale County was one of the first districts to go ahead and make their call on virtual learning. When we pulled data for some background reporting on another story, we could actually see that the way Omicron was affecting that community versus other metro counties, it was outsized, right? So you can't go back to school if you can't staff school. Right? So it doesn't matter what we think about protocols or the way that we approach where we stand on masking or anything else. Like, we actually need people to run the schools to go in person. And so the pandemic made the decision for us. So we've just seen a wide range of effects. And one thing that you have to remember, and I know other panelists can talk more about this, is when we're using this data to drive decisions, if that's what's driving COVID protocol decisions, we're only as good as the data we collect, right? That was another difference that we saw between school districts. When you are not counting cases the same way, or you stop contact tracing before this one or that one, you have different types of information available to drive your decisions. APS, I believe, is one of the few districts in the country that funded an epidemiologist in the beginning of this to come up with a plan for how we measure the harm, right? So harm doesn't have to be pediatric case count or hospitalizations or death. Harm can be outbreaks that translate into something else in the community. But if you don't have anyone to collect the data or the resources to do that, you have no data points to drive those decisions. And so the short answer to all of this is there were a range of approaches on the local level, but we know this is not an incident that just affects us on our neighborhood street or in our county or whatever. Whatever we do here affects Fulton County, affects the next county, you know. So there was no uniform way to approach this.
Thank you. Maureen, is there anything going on legislatively right now related to schools and the pandemic that we should be aware of?
There's a few direct bills speaking to COVID in the schools. And one of those is a relatively new idea from the Governor Brian Kemp, that parents be allowed, regardless of what the school wants to do, parents decide whether or not children wear masks or not. And that's simply, I think, a sort of a last hurrah, because at this point, most school districts are moving away from masks. A few of them still have mandates, but I think this is part of the greater issue that we'll discuss, and that is a big attempt this session for the governor, with the help of the folks in the General Assembly, to establish his conservative credentials. So we have a lot of bills that are about parent rights, and what's coming up now is, even yesterday there was a House education hearing on the governor's parent Bill of Rights. And a few of the parents who spoke were a group that I call the anti-maskers. They have long opposed masks in schools, even at the height of the pandemic. And they want that built into the parents' Bill of Rights, that health issues are the parents' choice. It doesn't speak directly to masks, but it gets there. And that right now is not in the bill. So the pandemic opened a big issue. The pandemic led to a parental right discussion, which the governor has taken, and people around the country have taken much farther. They have gone beyond just masks to many other issues that we can discuss, from books to racial discussions to even something as sort of accepted as diversity, equity, and inclusion. That now is under fire. So it began with masks, and it has simply gotten bigger and bigger.
Thank you. Jason, in your role as chair of the Atlanta Public Schools Board of Education, can you give us an overview of how you've gone about navigating what at times seems like an impossible task of leading a district the size of APS through a global pandemic? And while you're at it, maybe what do you foresee as the next set of COVID issues that you'll have to deal with as the year closes out? I know there's been this new variant on Omicron that seems to be starting to, might potentially be an issue down the line. Yep. As you look ahead towards the beginning of next year, what do you see as the main thing to think about?
Yeah, well, I think that first we have to shout out superintendents across the country who have had to lead in these difficult times, and of course appreciate our school leaders, our principals, and our teachers in particular, who have had to just battle through this pandemic. And I think the biggest issue that we've had to battle through is the fact that we haven't had much guidance from for a long time had very little guidance from the federal or state governments, which essentially caused what Nicole said, which was local control, right? Every district did something that they felt was best for their district, but that looked very different for each district. And that caused a lot of confusion amongst parents. It caused a lot of confusion, angst amongst staff. And I think that contributed to the environment we saw, where you saw teachers in particular, but also school districts hailed as heroes at the beginning of the pandemic. And then by October of 2022, you saw, or 2021, or no, 2020, actually, you saw a flip of that narrative. So teachers went from heroes to, selfish human beings in just 6 months, because you saw school districts doing completely different things based on what we thought was the best thing to do given the science that we had at the time, right? So I think that lack of guidance really did make this job even more impossible of leading school districts. And then you layer on top of that the politics of it. And I think when we look back on this pandemic 20 years from now, we will see that the politicization of the pandemic hurt students the most, because at the end of the day, and there have already been articles about this, but you see that people who lean to the left tended to overreact. People who lean to the right tended to overreact on the other side, when in reality, we probably should have been somewhere in the middle. And without the guidance, how do you know where the middle is? So that has caused us a lot of issues. So I would say the lack of guidance, the politicization of everything made this job impossible. The third thing that I would say that was a weight on the shoulders of the school district was just the level of wraparound services that we needed to provide our students and their families. We already knew that school districts provide a ton of services that they shouldn't be providing, but we have to, because it's the only way that we can clear barriers. But the pandemic showed that literally families were relying on schools for basic needs. We provided hundreds of thousands of meals to families during the pandemic, each and every day while we were virtual, and during the summer, and during breaks. We continued to provide food, clothing, internet. Literally, APS was handing out internet hotspots to students and their families so that they connect virtually. Mental health has been a huge thing that we've had to bolster. And of course, our administration has had to become public health experts. And as Nicole pointed out, we hired an epidemiologist, but just because the job of managing the public health considerations was too large. And it's a continuous thing. It's going to continue, unfortunately, into the future. So it required APS to pivot, and frankly, we've been on the more careful side. We still require masks to this day, although I think that's changing soon. We are one of the only school districts in the state that do surveillance testing, which is something that is common in the northeast and northwest of the country, but didn't really pick up in the southeast. And we also have things like the epidemiologist that helps to set certain standards that we live by. All of those things require us moving forward to think about what the new normal looks like. I don't think that we can continue to do a lot of the stuff, and when I say we, I mean APS specifically, can continue to do a lot of stuff that we've been doing over the last 2 years just because people are tired. And that is everyone across the board. They're just tired. So how do we adapt to keep our students and our staff safe, right? And at the same time, adapt to what appears to be a new normal where you have COVID transforming itself and us seeing a surge every 6 or 8 months. How do we adapt to that in a way that preserves some kind of normalcy for our students, but at the same time maintains safety for our staff and our families? And I think that is where we're going to have to focus over the next few months and couple of years. And then the second piece about that recovery is going to be, how do we fill the gaps that were just exacerbated by the pandemic? And you see that many of these school districts are doing kind of summer learning to help their students kind of catch up from that lost time. But it is undoubtedly gaps were exacerbated, and issues that we saw pre-pandemic are much worse now, whether they were academic or behavioral or anything else. They are much worse now, and school districts are going to have to work to recover just like our communities are.
Thank you. Principal Foster, what has all of this looked like on the ground at your school the last couple of years? I know it's been incredibly challenging for all involved, but have there been any maybe silver linings?
Absolutely. Just looking at it from the school level perspective, I think what has allowed us to get through this moment, or continue to get through this moment, is that we've had pretty solid leadership that has kind of laid out the plan that we're going to take and how we're going to approach this pandemic, with the initial pivoting to virtual learning back in 2020, 2020, to now where we've moved back into the schools. But it has been a lot, like Jason alluded to. Teachers are so tired right now that we are still trying to push because we understand that not only did that gap get larger, we also have to deal with learning loss, the loss that happened because kids weren't in school, but we also have to deal with the learning that never happened because kids weren't in school. And so, like he said, that just pushed that gap a whole lot bigger. And so we're spending a lot of time trying to fill that gap. I think if there is a silver lining, it is this idea around personalized learning, because our kids are coming back in so many different places as it relates to their learning, right? And so you're not going to be able to just sit and teach to a group of 25 students, because they're all in all different places. You got kids that, in spite of the pandemic, they still had exposure, they still were read to, they still participated in activities. And then you got kids that when they left this building, there was no learning that happened until they came back. So you got all of these kids sitting in your classroom. So how, as an educator, do you make sure that you're meeting the needs of all of these students as they are coming? And I think personalized learning is one way that, and the district is moving towards that, is to kind of bring learning to where students are as they're walking into your classroom. So I think that is the silver lining that has come out of it, but also this idea around social emotional learning, that students need to socialize with each other, that they can't live in this bubble of isolationism. They have to be with their peers, and that is important to their growth. We see a lot of kids now, particularly our kids that are in first and second grade, that may have missed most of kindergarten and part of first grade, how they are very different than those students that were in kindergarten, in school, and went to first grade, just with how do we manage in a whole group of people? You know, how do we walk down the hallway? How do we do all those different things that we took for granted? We now begin to see how important those foundational years are to our students. And when they are missed, that makeup doesn't happen necessarily over a year, but it takes some time to get to where we think students ought to be, say when they get into third grade. And we're not even talking about the academic piece, just that social piece, and being able to function in a group of students. It has been challenging, but I think we are well on the road of recovery. I'm happy that we are moving towards, I'm happy that we were back in school. I think kids need to be here, absolutely. And I think for us, because of the mitigation strategies that were in place and have been in place, we haven't had big issues of COVID outbreaks. So we've been able to stay in school pretty much open. I think we had to close down a class or two, maybe once or twice, but school-wide, we've been able to stay open. So I'm very appreciative of that happening because I realize, and we realize that kids really need to be here in school. I think the surveillance testing really lends itself to having kids in school because we can catch a positive case quickly, isolate, and we can keep learning happening. And even those kids that go home are still able to continue their learning through in that virtual space. So I'm happy that we are kind of easing up or beginning to ease up on all the mask wearing, because I know kids are tired of the mask, and I don't know how most of my kids even look because I see them in masks all the time. So I will be happy to move as we move, when it's appropriate, to move away from mandated masking. But I do think that we are on our way to a new normal. May not necessarily be what we experienced prior to the pandemic, but I think we are moving back to a more normalized space where we are able to see each other and engage with each other very differently than we have over the past 2 years.
Great, thank you. I know as a parent, the twice weekly surveillance, the testing, as I get those, emails from you on Mondays and Thursdays, it is comforting to see, for example, today, no positive cases all throughout the school. It's just, I knew it was important, but I think I underestimated just how much of a comfort that would be just while things were, especially while things were at the height. Let's turn now to an issue that Maureen hinted at that really seems to be dominating headlines right now, and legislatures in many states, including Georgia. There seems to be this wave of supposed concern about educational content and what students are learning in schools today. And we're seeing book bans, so-called Parents' Bill of Rights, legislation aimed at restricting teachers from teaching certain parts of history, or even attempting to prohibit schools from making people feel discomfort when being taught about race-related issues. And I think Maureen's right that this all stems back to this idea of sort of parental control and how much control and awareness parents have with regard to what's going on in the classroom. Maureen, can you give us a lay of the land of how this is all currently playing out in Georgia?
So right now in the General Assembly, there are a lot of bills that I think just waste people's time and have really no impact on student learning. And those bills are moving. Now, not all of them are moving. For example, we were expecting a bill that would be what we call the book banning bill. It's actually called obscene content. That seems to have been sidelined. And that's because the emphasis seems to be on two primary areas. One is the issue of the divisive concepts. And that is sort of a broad umbrella, but that was actually heard yesterday and moved out of House Education. And that bill essentially is a lot of white parents who feel like in their students' classes, their children are made to feel guilty for being oppressors. They don't like the term white privilege. They don't like the term Black Lives Matter. They feel all of this is political. And these parents want schools to stay out of that. The problem with these bills is that they allegedly would not stifle important conversations about race and racism, but those important conversations, the legislators behind these bills want them to focus only on the past. What they don't want is a lot of current events. In fact, one version of this bill that luckily I think is over would have banned compelling students to discuss any current event issues that they did not feel comfortable taking part in. So that we probably will see one of those bills, if not passed, it will definitely go to the floor for a vote. And again, that's under the guise of divisive concept. It really is the response to critical race theory, which was a manufactured sort of hysteria about whether or not that concept, which apparently comes from the field of law and teaches about embedded racism at the institutional level, including in the courts, in policing, how that has somehow infiltrated the schools and seems to be everywhere, according to these parents. And as one school board member mentioned to me, you can tell parents all day long, you're not teaching critical race theory, which would be lovely if we had children in K-12 who could comprehend. I mean, that would be a great feat to be able to teach that level of a law school concept in K-12, but it doesn't exist in the curriculum, and parents will simply not believe me. So as I said earlier, I do believe that Governor Kemp is exploiting this to some degree, this parental bill of rights. That simply ties together legal rights parents have right now to look at curriculum. It puts it all in one place. But what those bills collectively do is stop teachers and stop schools from taking on anything that they think will prompt lines of speakers at school board meetings. And two quick examples. In Alabama, under their bill already enacted, similar language to the bill pending here, parents are complaining about Black History Month as a divisive concept. In Tennessee, 2 weeks ago, a group of moms, they filed a complaint against their children learning about Ruby Bridges and her walk with the woman, the little girl flanked by the U.S. Marshals entering school. They feel like that is discomforting to children in class. So we have Oklahoma. One of the teachers there were told to avoid the terms diversity and white privilege. So the problem with this bill is if it does in fact pass, I think we will see Georgia teachers in schools quite leery to tackle hard subjects that need to be talked about. We have to talk about modern racism. We have to talk about how that looks in our state, how that looks in the students' lives. And these bills, I certainly think will stop that.
Principal Foster, all of these bills we've just been talking about, how do you think if some or all of them pass, it will affect teachers in your school and just how your school functions?
Fortunately, at the elementary level, I think we will escape a lot of that because our curriculum doesn't go that deep into those subject matters. So I think at the elementary schools we will be okay. But I do fear this notion around the critical race theory is something that is being taught. It's a curriculum or it's a training or it's a workshop to teach people. I wish there were some way that we could expose to people exactly what that is, that it's a theory of thinking. And it's certainly not anything like Maureen said, anything that can be taught in our public schools. I mean, you need almost a master's degree to understand that kind of a theory. So I don't think it will have a huge impact on elementary schools because our content doesn't go that deep into those subjects. It's when we begin to, I know the district is pushing equity really hard, and somehow that language, the privileged white people and those type of conversations, those are the ones that may impact what happens at the elementary school level when it's centered around equity and making sure that we give equal access to all students or all students have equal access to education. Then you may see some bubbling up of things, but I think that will stay at the parent and board level. I don't think it will hugely impact the teaching at the elementary school level.
Thank you. Jason, how do you think schools and legislature should best balance all these competing concerns underlying all this? And to what degree should parents have a say in what and how their children are learning at school?
Yeah, so I think parents should have and already do have a say in what their children learn. I think that we have to start off by saying that these concerns, as Maureen said, are manufactured. The only reason that these bills are being considered in the legislature are because politically it worked for Republicans in Virginia and elsewhere across the country late last year to win elections. And because we are an election year in Georgia, it's the perfect opportunity to galvanize their base, and they can do that at little to no cost, because as Principal Foster just mentioned, it has limited impact at what actually happens in the classroom. If anything, what these bills do is that they just put up more paperwork, red tape processes for teachers to have to, and districts to have to go through. And at a time when teachers have already had to battle through COVID and those politics, to now have to do things like potentially turn in lesson plans many, many months in advance, have to watch every single word they say during Black History Month, or watch what they say on MLK, the Friday before MLK Day, right? All of these things are just making it harder for us to attract and retain teachers in our schools. And I think as far as how we balance these concerns, or how we deal with this, I think we just need to leave school districts alone. We've had too many interruptions, distractions. Public education is already hard enough. Education generally is already hard enough. But over the last 15, 20 years, and Maureen's an expert, so she could probably tell you even more, it's literally school districts across this state have been distracted by something, whether it's curriculum changes, standard changes, COVID, now that these politics. I mean, it seems like every few years there's a disruption, and at the end of the day, what school leaders, what students, what teachers, what families ultimately want is to just be in a place where they have a quality education. And I think at the state level, just like at the local level, we have to think through whether whatever policy we're considering, does that actually have an impact on student achievement? If it doesn't, then we need to push it out of the way and focus on our kids. And clearly, that is not the focus this year.
Nicole, what role do you think the media has to play in the rise of these kinds of legislative efforts? And where do you think all this is coming from, and why now?
Well, I think we need to get plain about what's happening. And one thing that Maureen just pointed out, she was talking about who was showing up and who was complaining. We have to explicitly say when we're talking about a certain group of parents, or we're talking about white parents in most of these cases, right? If not all of them, where these complaints are stemming from. You can't frame the concerned parent without describing who we're talking about. It's like we're letting one thing, we have to explicitly say who is showing up and what it is about. I can tell you, because I'll go ahead, and it's not giving away anything I'm working on at the moment, but in a wide records request to the state, I can sit here today and say there are currently no formal complaints of CRT with the State Board of Education, where you would file and explicitly say, this is being taught at my school, we need the state to step in. Get to the basics in your journalism, right? We can't just anecdotally walk around and write about political talking points, or, parents are concerned. Who are they? What are they concerned about? What actions have been taken? And right now in the state of Georgia, you have no formal action that has been taken where it can be taken. So that needs to be included in the reporting. I'm also a big fan of historical context in helping us understand where we are today. And I think journalists need to get into this habit more often. Jason just alluded to it, talking about every few years. I know Maureen can talk about the history of what's happened in public school education in Georgia. What we are facing today is not new. It's not new. Curriculum and banning certain topics and this and that, it is, it's almost quintessential to our public education system. Take it back to any era you want. If you want to go post-Civil War, if you want to go the Civil Rights Movement, if you want to go 20 years ago, these movements have resurfaced in different ways. And so I think we ought to contextualize in our reporting how this has manifested itself in the past and what it is doing now. So we use the records, be explicit. Let's be real about what we're talking about. In terms of impact to the schools, if we talk about this in the context of elementary education, I would argue that the impact based on interviews that I've done so far, and even a notice I received from my 5th grader this morning, from a teacher, social studies teacher, who says, as you know, Russia has attacked Ukraine. I want to leave this conversation to you at home. Just if your kids are going to have concerns about what they hear in the house, whatever, it's not going to be my thing. I was like, okay, moved on to the next paragraph. I'm about to start teaching a lesson, didn't say what lesson it was, that may offend some students. Let me explicitly say, I love all of my students, regardless of race, religion, sexual orientation. I treat them all the same, but if you want to opt out of this lesson, please let me know. Well, how would I know what I'm opting out of? The effect is in polarizing or paralyzing teachers from doing their jobs. I have no idea what she's talking about. And I don't care to opt my kid out of anything right now. If I see something, just like in the past, I would raise an alarm because I understand what my child is doing in school. No one has ever stopped you from understanding what's coming home with them, what's being taught in the schools. So I think that's where the effect is. If you've got people who have been under all of this pressure during the pandemic to perform, to come up with these things, all the things that were just discussed, and now you think you've got to put out a disclaimer about something that you can't describe, don't want to put in writing, but you want it on the record that I love all of y'all and I'm going to treat you the same, and I don't mean to offend any of you. What are we talking about? Scared to do their jobs. That affects the learning time, the day. So we anecdotally, we need to get to that. And one more thing, and I know we'll move on. We haven't wholly examined this yet, but yeah, people leaving their jobs because their job titles have been looped into a talking point that it's not, right? If we want to talk about DEI, journalists, please explain what DEI is. It ain't all about race. It's not. DEI could be, Principal Foster just talked about how we meet students where they are, right? Because they're coming from different places out of this pandemic. DEI can mean I'm training teachers to recognize when I've got food insecurity in this kid's home versus this one, they're struggling this way. So I need to approach this kid this way versus that way. I can't approach Tim and Susie the same way and they sit next to each other in class. Tim may be acting out a certain way because he has no food to eat. That's like a part of DEI. It ain't CRT. Make people, when they make points and when you're quoting them, you are not a stenographer. Make them define what they are talking about and then contextualize that so we understand what this is. Otherwise, it's all noise.
Can I add something in, because Nicole's comment reminded me of two very real impacts at the local level along the lines of what she just talked about. One is Cherokee County a couple years ago making a commitment to equity, and I think the superintendent there was aiming to do exactly what Nicole just talked about, right? Increasingly diverse school district with various needs. How do we make sure that we're giving each child what they need to thrive? And around that time that he appointed a chief equity officer, this whole debate started, and parents came to meetings and And they were saying CRT, but they were also saying equity in that. And because of that, the chief equity officer resigned before they even started. And I don't think they filled that position since. So equity in Cherokee County School District has stalled because of this debate. Similarly, in Cobb County, we have a situation where ADL's No Place for Hate is no longer in their schools because of the concern that being anti-bias or anti-hate for whatever reason will make certain kids feel bad. So a program that has been in Georgia for 30 years is now not in a school district because of this debate. So it's having very real impacts. And I think it's going to continue to have those kinds of impacts across the state and across the country. And that's unfortunate because students will be missing out on opportunities. They'll be missing out on resources, missing out on conversations, discussions, learning that can help them be better individuals moving forward.
Can I add one thing to that? And that is that a few weeks ago, we had the spectacle of a North Georgia legislator sending a letter to the regents wanting to know any course being taught on a public college that mentioned white privilege. That took some of those colleges one full week of people working to look at every course description. And it led to a response from the regents to the legislator of 102 pages. So that is the kind of craziness that we are in right now. And I really wish we had a chancellor who would have looked at that initial letter and said, sorry, why don't you look through all the catalogs? But I'm not using university staff to look at every single course. And including, believe it or not, one of the courses listed ended up being data processing privilege because it had the word privilege in it and it had to be listed. So this is the craziness that this is taking. And it really is a waste of a lot of people's time, and it redirects energy from what they should be doing, and that is teaching.
It's happening in public schools too with records requests, by the way. Paralyzing districts with looking for evidence of something, and these folks, you'd be surprised at who's processing records requests today. And a lot of, well, I'll leave it at that. Yes, we could go on and on about this, but it's by design, it cripples productivity at all levels. So this isn't just about the core of a talking point, it's about operation that you cripple.
Thank you. I know we're coming up on the end of our time. We have, if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask our panelists, feel free to put those in the chat. I also want to talk briefly, and we've seen efforts this legislative cycle regarding school funding or so-called school choice efforts. And it seems like these issues, again, come up year after year, and somewhat in waves as well. Jason, could you give us an overview on the current state of school funding in Georgia? How does it work? What decisions are made at, say, the federal or state and local levels?
Yeah, and I'll be quick to focus on what's happening at the state level with some good news and some things to watch out for, as you mentioned, Meredith. The good news is that the governor is proposing in his new budget to fully fund QBE, which is great. It's only happened a couple times in the last 20 years. So,
right. Can you tell us what QBE stands for?
Yeah, so it's a formula that supposedly is enough funding to provide a child quality basic education. And it's a formula that was developed over 20 years ago, and it was seen as a baseline funding for school districts to provide that quality basic education. The problem is that even after it was initially adopted, the state didn't fully fund it. And in 17 of the last 20 years, did not fully fund it, and in some cases was not even close to fully funding it. We are finally getting back to a point where it's being fully funded. There was a gap last year where districts were asked, or there's budgets were reduced at the state level. That has been filled in the amended 2022 budget, and then moving forward in 2023, they're going to fully fund QBE. They're also increasing transportation funding to help school districts replace buses, which is incredibly important, and districts are incredibly grateful for that. And then there's some salary increases built into the budget as well, which will allow school districts to raise salaries for teachers and staff. So that's the good. The items to watch out for are the continued efforts to pass private school vouchers, school choice programs, where it's essentially giving parents, and this goes right along this topic, gives parents the opportunity to opt out of the public school system and take state tax dollars with them to a private institution. The ironic thing about that is that these bills allow parents to take public funding and take it to institutions where there is no transparency, there's no oversight, there's no control, which are the very things that they're complaining about with the public school system. So there's a little irony built into that, but that threat is real. Georgia has a private school scholarship already in policy, and there are always attempts, some of them successful, to expand that. And we've seen them trying to expand that this year. And ultimately what that does is take away money that would ultimately go to school districts.
Great, thank you. Principal Foster, how do larger statewide funding issues affect your day-to-day work in your school? So when school funding gets cut, where and how do you actually see that in your school?
Usually when there are cuts, there are two big buckets of money that we get. It's usually around staffing, so people, and programming. So the different programs that we're able to offer to students, like for my school, because we're over 500 kids, we're funded fairly well. So we're able to have, because of that, a full-time PE teacher, a full-time art teacher, a full-time music teacher, a full-time Spanish teacher. But there are other schools who don't have as many kids. They aren't able to fund at that level. So they may have a half-time art teacher and a half-time PE teacher. And so the programming looks very differently at my school than it would at another school where they don't have as many students when there are cuts in the budget, because those are the places that you have to pull from, because those are the biggest buckets of money. So when the state cuts, it trickles down to the local schools in programming and staffing would be the biggest areas.
Thank you. Nicole, it seems like buzzwords and euphemisms, they pervade discussions about school funding. How do you go about reporting on school funding issues in a way that is accurate without being inflammatory?
I think you really have to get to the basics of what you're talking about. Not everyone in your viewership or readership understands how policies and things work. So processes first, right? And we harped on that a lot during the elections, because we had the same type of rhetoric around the way an absentee ballot makes it from request to your home to being counted, right? So in dealing with more complex issues and lots of players and hands in the pot, explain to people how it works. Because it's easy to get caught up in rhetoric and then not be able to define what it is that what you're dealing with here. So I just think, again, being very explicit in explaining basics goes a long way. And I know that sounds really basic, right? But it's often missing from our reporting, especially when we get into beats and we're so steeped in something and know a lot about a lot of different things and assume people do. And that's not always the case.
Thank you. I know we're running short on time. I I did see one question in the chat, and I'm not sure if, I think the attendees can't see the question, so I just wanted to, they might have just seen your answer, so I just wanted to share that with everyone. So the question was, this is the only time that I've ever heard panelists at the Bar Media Seminar criticizing the use of Open Records Act requests. Typically, panelists in this program have supported the transparency provided by the Georgia Open Records Act. What has happened? Disruption has always been the price of government transparency. And so Nicole responded, that she wasn't criticizing the use of the Open Records Act. She was instead talking about specific filing strategy that leads to the disruption of operation. I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that, Nicole, or if that pretty much captures it. Oh, you're muted. Glad that had to happen once, right?
It's actually something we're looking into across the country. We use open records all the time. I would not criticizing the use of it. When you are digging for something you know is not there and causing disruption, if that makes any sense. I'm trying to say this without talking too much about ongoing reporting, but it's in strategy, not the use of it. It's in the good faith use of it. I'll say that.
When
We are
the
seeing
when the
disruption.
use ends up clogging the system. And
Clogging the system, right. And
transparency.
there's a lot more of that going on than you may think. So I don't know if Maureen wants to. But
This actually probably would be a good opportunity, since we only have a few minutes left, just without any other questions from folks, I'd like to take an opportunity just to maybe go around once and just see if anyone has any final thoughts on any of these issues or anything related to schools we haven't already covered today.
I'd like to just say one thing, and that is that one thing that we hear a lot about is that teachers are unhappy, and I certainly think that's true in surveys and polls. What we don't know is what that will lead to, because teachers, we do see lower enrollment, honestly, in our college prep programs right now in Georgia, and that is true. And we are seeing some younger teachers who I think have technical skills that are highly desirable right now leaving, but we have not seen any wholesale exodus from the classroom. And that will be a year or two before we can tell. So I just want to caution folks that while I think it's much more difficult to be a teacher, and these political pressures that are now showing up in the classroom are going to add to that, we don't know if that will cause the profession, people to flee in greater numbers. And if that does happen, Georgia will have a problem because our pipeline is not as robust as it used to be.
Thank you. Anyone else have any final parting thoughts?
On the funding piece and just supporting schools generally, I was at an opening of a service center for John Lewis Invictus Academy, which is a middle school in Atlanta Public Schools, and they were opening a center where they're providing mental health services, they're providing food and clothing and a lot of the stuff that we've provided during the pandemic. And while it's great, it also led me to think about the fact that schools shouldn't be doing that work. It should be the state, local government, our teachers, our administrators should be focused on teaching and learning and not all of these other issues. So when I think about state funding and the social safety net, whether it's at the local, state, federal level, if we truly want to help schools improve, then we need to take a lot of the burden that they have off of their shoulder. And they have an incredible burden that oftentimes has nothing to do with teaching and learning. But unfortunately, they have to deal with it because, as the principal at John Lewis Invictus Academy was talking about, if they don't deal with those issues, then the student's not going to learn. And we're seeing that each and every day. So I encourage folks to encourage more of a social safety net for our families.
Thank you. And one parting thought from for folks in the chat, we see that today is National Student Press Freedom Day, and Georgia is one of 35 states that still lacks a law protecting journalism students and educators against retaliation. So on that note, thank you all to all of our panelists for being here today, and for all of our attendees for joining us. It's a great conversation. I really appreciate your time. We'll see everyone back here at 3:30 for our final session of the day, Communicating in the Disinformation Age. Thanks, everyone.